So 12 minutes is the plan. Let's see what we can do. So we're going to talk about the last section of chapter 10. It's got two really important events in it. The reason I say they're really important, take a look at your second objective there. We're getting into the real hardcore causes of the Civil War. We'll be talking about the Civil War and Reconstruction in fourth quarter, but everything we do really starting now is really heavily going to play right into what it is that ultimately causes the South to decide to secede. I also want you to remember federalism, a concept I know you learned well in civics, so we'll recap that as well. So we'll start with the Bank War. One thing I don't feel like I explained well to you, but which I will explain well to you now, is the National Bank and why it was so controversial. Remember that this was one of Hamilton's initial parts of his plan, his economic plan, that he wanted to see a national bank of the United States. So some of the pros of that bank are that it does make loans to businesses. It's going to be helpful to certain small businesses because they're going to make loans because obviously businesses need capital, they need materials, they need technology. So it is going to be helpful to some businesses. And another reason, and especially you know why Hamilton envisioned it, was going to be a safe place for federal government money. Some of the cons, some of the reasons that people opposed it, and you are already aware that it was the Federalists and the Northerners who tended to support it, and it was the Southerners, the strict constructionists, who opposed it. And those were your anti-federalists, then your Republicans, and now your Democrats. One of the things they didn't like about it was that the National Bank would impose its will. It would limit what state banks could do. And the reason it did that was to keep the currency stable. If state banks were making too many loans, there was the fear that the currency would no longer be of value, that the banks would default on their loans. So the National Bank did play a role in regulating the loans made by the state banks. The other thing is that, and probably with good reason, the National Bank was associated with these wealthy elites. Often these were people from the North. The Second National Bank is in Philadelphia. The man named Nicholas Biddle is the president of it, and he is a well-connected, extremely wealthy family, political figure of the North, and understandably the South is skeptical of that. So that's the arguments in favor of and against the National Bank. Take a look at that political cartoon there. I'm not going to have you go too hard on that one, but look at the title of it, General Jackson Slaying the Many-Headed Monster. And this is a depiction of the bank war because General Jackson gets it in his head that he is going to kill the bank. And this image is, of course, making fun of him in his quest to kill the bank, which certainly was not easy to do and which was multifaceted. So you should remember that the second bank was chartered in 1816 for 20 years. So it was supposed to be rechartered in 1836, but Nicholas Biddle, the man I mentioned who was the president of the National Bank, attempted to get it rechartered early in 1832, and Congress voted and did so. But Jackson, in one of my favorite Jackson quotes, and that really is saying something because there's a lot of them. He was lying sick in bed when he heard about this plan to recharter the bank, and he said, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." So he vetoes it. He vetoes the bill passed by Congress rechartering it, and in that way he does kill the monster that is the bank. This is a great example of how the power of the president will increase. As he uses his veto power, I mean, consider that he's the man who purports to be all about democracy and all about giving the people what they want, but he's going to turn around and veto a law that's been passed at least by the people's representatives in Congress. But you're going to see the rise of a more powerful president, a president who's not afraid to veto legislation that he doesn't approve of. Remember that most of Jackson's biographers, and I tend to subscribe to this, what they believe about Jackson is that what he believed really was what he wanted is what he should get. And that's the case with the bank. He decided it was bad for America, so he killed it. The reason he got away with it, and just like the reason that he got away with defying John Marshall in Worcester v. Georgia, was that generally the American people supported him. They agreed with him. So it's very possible that his decision to veto the bank and do away with the bank is what really contributes to this panic of 1837 that's going to, because you know his successor is Martin Van Buren is elected in 1836. The panic, this economic crisis that kicks in 1837 that's going to tank Van Buren, or Van Ruin as they called him, his presidency, is probably caused by this. Jackson decides not only that he's going to kill the bank, but that he's going to withdraw all of the federal money from the National Bank, and he's going to put it in state banks. Even when he's told that he can't do this, that this is unconstitutional, he does it anyway because He's Jackson. Just to recap some things that you will want to remember before we get into the tariff, I want to remind you, and let's go all the way back even to the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, and let's go back to that concept of federalism. If you don't remember federalism, federalism is the idea that the national government should have some power and the state governments should have some power. The opposite of this is sort of, well, not the pure opposite of it, but you also have confederalism, a confederacy. In a confederacy, you'll see that the states have most of the power. They agree to come together, but that they maintain the right to do or not do what the national government says. But from the very beginning of America, we were a federal system, and that's the system that the Founding Fathers set up. However, they did put in the 10th Amendment, and the 10th Amendment is going to become important when we start to talk about states' rights. The 10th Amendment says that any powers not expressly or spelled out given to the federal government are reserved for the states and the people. So take a look at federalism is always embodied in this Venn diagram. These are powers that only the national government can do. These are ones that only the states can do. And one of those is establishing schools. Giving marriage licenses is one that's generally believed to be a power reserved to the states, which is why it was so controversial when the federal government decided to protect gay marriage. So, when we're talking about states' rights, let's take a walk down memory lane, the crucial events that we already know about so far. In 1798, Virginia and Kentucky issued resolutions or voted upon statements of opinion and threatened to nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts for being unconstitutional. You remember that no one else really takes their side, so nothing much comes of that. And then as soon as Adams is out of office after his 4 years, Jefferson repeals both of these, so it doesn't actually come to a head there. In 1814, towards the end of the War of 1812, New Englanders decide that they're going to meet to actually discuss seceding from the Union because they disapprove of Mr. Madison's war. Take a look at that meme. It's going to become real relevant later. So the nullification crisis and the tariff of abominations. In 1828, Congress is going to raise the tariff. We've talked a lot about the tariff. If you don't remember how the tariff works, watch that video again. We've talked a lot about it. Congress has decided it's going to raise the tariff. Remember that raising the tariff is helpful. It's going to not only protect American manufacturing, it's going to raise the price for American manufacturing as well and allow them to make more money. And that's going to somewhat benefit the West because that money that's spent that revenue that's gained by the tariff is going to be able to be spent on public projects for the West, but it's going to raise the price on the manufactured goods that the South so desperately needs. Calhoun is still the vice president at this point, and the argument of Calhoun, because he's that staunch states' rights advocate, he's going to say that the Union is just an agreement of states to come together, and if the states choose not to be a part of it anymore, the states retain powers to nullify laws that they view as unfair. Calhoun tells Jackson, if you use force to enforce the tariff, South Carolina is going to secede. Now, it's about the tariff. Of course it's about the tariff. The tariff is hurting the South. They called it the tariff of abominations because an abomination is something that's hateful to you. Yeah, it's about the tariff, but if we want to be real, and even the Southerners at that time admitted, it's also about slavery, because if the federal government can force a tariff down their throat, who's to say that the federal government can't tell them that they can't own slaves? So that's that elephant in the room that everyone is painfully aware of. This is the set of quotes. I told you about this in class, that at this point, Jackson and Calhoun are still theoretically president and vice president, but they are at an event, they're at a dinner, and Jackson raises his hand, raises his glass, and in a very, very clear statement to Calhoun, he says, our federal union, it must be preserved. Remember that Calhoun has threatened to secede. Calhoun doesn't miss a step. I love it. He also raises his glass, and in a toast, he says, the Union, next to our liberty, most dear. And then like drop the mic. This is like a huge oh moment. I can't believe this, because look at what Calhoun is saying. Calhoun is saying, yeah, the Union is really important. The only thing that's more important than the Union, my liberty, which from this we can only infer is my liberty to own slaves. My liberty to own people and deny them of their rights to freedom is one of the liberties that I will protect, and it's more important to me than the Union. So we've set up a real showdown here. So to recap the most important events, 32, so in 28, they passed that higher tariff. In 1832, Congress passes a law that lowers some of the tariffs, but doesn't lower the tariffs on textiles. South Carolina has a state convention and votes to nullify that tariff, and they're going to refuse to collect it. So Jackson issues a proclamation, and he warns them that disunion by force, aka seceding by force, disunion by force is armed treason. And you know that treason is a crime against government, and treason can be punished by hanging. Calhoun resigns as vice president because it's just getting too darn awkward. In 1833, Congress passes 2 laws. One of them really ratchets up the level of tension because the force bill is passed, and what the force bill does is give Jackson permission to take soldiers down to South Carolina and enforce this tariff and make sure that it's collected. At the same time, they're working hard to avoid this happening, so they pass a compromise tariff that's going to, over 10 years, lower the level of the tariff, and by the end of 10 years, it'll be back down to the sort of basic protective tariff level that it was. So as a result of both of those things, South Carolina is going to back down, and it's going to repeal its resolution of nullification, and it's going to accept, though bitterly, this tariff for now. Still elephant in the room, slavery. A couple elections. In 1836, you're going to have Martin Van Buren be elected. That's, remember, Jackson's VP of his second term. The Whigs were that second party that was formed. We had that brief period of good feelings when there were not parties, but the Whigs are going to form really in opposition to Jackson. Their plan is to run 3 different people, so you can see they ran Harrison, White, and Webster, and their hope was that nobody would get a majority and it would get pushed to the House, just like in 1824, but that doesn't happen. Van Buren wins. He's riding the associated with Jackson, and you guys still love Jackson, and you, in fact, voted for Jackson for 10 years after he was dead. He's riding that wave, but there's going to be a panic in 1837. It's an economic crisis, and it's just going to ruin Van Buren's presidency. Remember, he was called Martin Van Ruin. To break down how that worked for you, the British experience, there's an economic slump in Britain, which means that they're not buying as much cotton, which means that cotton prices are going to fall, which means that the banks aren't going to be able to collect on those loans that they made to all of those farmers, and those are state banks. And then huge numbers of banks are going to fail. So remember when Jackson said, we're going to take the federal government's money out of the national bank and put it in state banks? Some of those banks are going to fail because they can't collect on loans. Remember how the National Bank had controlled the amount of loans that were put out so this wouldn't happen? Not anymore. So this is going to lead to an economic crisis that lasts about 6 years and is going to really ruin Van Buren and essentially end the era of the Jacksonians because of it. In 1840, Van Buren does run again, but he runs against William Henry Harrison, a Whig. You should recognize his name from some military campaigns. The Whigs this time are going to really get their act together, and they're going to run a very skillful campaign. There's going to be parades. There's going to be barbecues. They're starting to get the picture of what people want. There's going to be entertainment, and they're going to run on this log cabin campaign. They're going to show this image of William Henry Harrison. Here he is with his plow in hand. They call him the farmer of North Bend. We've got the eagle flying over him. The log cabin boys. He's going to call for reform and positive changes. So they're really starting to get like, oh, this is what people want. Harrison's going to win. The Whigs are going to win. And that's going to be the end of the Jacksonian era. But the issues that arose there are not going to disappear. Make sure you write a good summary, and I'll see you in class.